church in Corinth was a church plagued with problems, in part due to the city itself. Corinth was a cosmopolitan city, the Big Apple, the New York City of its day. Into Corinth flowed every religious idea and cult in the Roman Empire. The result was a population in religious confusion. To them, Paul brought the message of Christ's resurrection and of life after death. Paul started the church in Corinth and remained there for a year and a half. 3 years later, while he was in Ephesus, he became aware of serious problems in the Corinthian church and wrote them the letter we call 1 Corinthians. Dr. Justo L. Gonzalez describes for us the situation in the Corinthian church. He helps us understand the crucial importance of the doctrine of the bodily resurrection, in contrast to the idea of the immortality of the soul. And we will come to appreciate the resurrection body as God's new creation that removes the sting of death.
The world of the Corinthians to whom Paul wrote was a very confused world. It was also very confusing. A few centuries earlier, things had been simpler. If you had been born in Corinth in the classical times of Greece, the 5th or the 4th century BC, you would have known exactly who you were and what your place was in society. Religion would not have been an issue for you because everybody born in Corinth had the same gods. And there were very few foreigners around to confuse you with other gods or other ideas. But now, in the time of Paul, things were different. The whole world around the Mediterranean had been joined in a single empire, the Roman Empire. All along that empire and even beyond, people moved from one place to another. They mingled, they met other cultures and other gods. In Corinth itself, there were people from all over the empire. The city was at an important crossroads for travel both by land and by sea. From the southeast came ancient Egyptian myths and traditions. From the east came Jews with their Bible and their laws. From the northeast came ancient religions with orgiastic features. From Greece itself came rich philosophical traditions with such distinguished names as Plato and Aristotle. In other words, Corinth was cosmopolitan. The word cosmopolitan means that the city, the polis, now reflects the entire world, the cosmos. No wonder then that people in Corinth were confused. They were confused just as many are today. In particular, they were confused when it came to the resurrection and life after death. First of all, there were many then, as there are today, who simply believed that physical death was the end of everything. If that is the case, there's nothing left to do but to eat and drink and be merry. To these people, Paul says, if for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. Then there were others who believed in life after death, but not in the resurrection as Paul and the early church taught it. What these people believed, and many still believe today, was that the soul is immortal. This was the teaching of philosophers such as Socrates and Plato, and also of many mystics from the East. The soul is life itself, nothing can kill it. Some went so far as to claim that the souls of the dead come back in other people or even in animals. For all these people, religion is about the soul, which is what lives on after death, and not about the body. That was probably the reason some in Corinth believed that whatever they did with their sexuality did not matter. After all, sex has to do with the body, and life everlasting is of the soul. That was probably also the reason why some could eat their fill while others went hungry. If what is important is the soul, then who cares if some people are hungry? If the soul is immortal, then we do not really have to worry about it, for nothing can kill it, and we'll be okay no matter what. But Paul will have none of it. On the contrary, he says, we base our faith not on the immortality of the soul, but on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what we hope for is not that our souls will keep on living after our bodies die, but rather that we too will be raised with Christ. This is important for several reasons. First, it means that life after death is a gift from God, just as the creation of our very bodies is a gift from God. Apparently, some in Corinth argued that the resurrection was impossible. What kind of bodies will we have? What would they look like? We know of people in other places who objected that if several people through the ages have shared the same piece of matter, then when the resurrection comes, there will not be enough matter to go around, and some bodies will have holes. Paul responds that the point is precisely that the resurrection is an act of God just as much as was creation. In creation, God made different kinds of bodies. People bodies, animal bodies, bird bodies, fish bodies. For the resurrection, God will provide us with whatever bodies are necessary for the new order. What this means is that the future life is not just the natural outcome of the present. It is an act of God's marvelous and powerful mercy. It is the product of the same power that said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Still, because it is a physical resurrection with real bodies, it means that whatever we do here with our present bodies and whatever we do to other people's bodies does have eternal significance. That is why Paul insisted that those in Corinth who had much must share it with those in Corinth and elsewhere who had little. That is also why he insisted that Christians must be responsible in the sexual use of their bodies. The future life, life eternal, is bodily life. And we had better begin to practice here and now for the future that has been promised to us. The doctrine of resurrection is important also because it takes death seriously. For those who simply believe in the immortality of the soul, death does not amount to much. It is not a real enemy. For some, it is even a friend. But the resurrection means that Jesus really died. That for us, death is equally real and equally an enemy. But it means also that thanks to the resurrection of Jesus, even this real and mighty enemy has been overcome. But the most important reason Paul focuses his teaching on the resurrection is that Jesus rose from the dead. For Paul and for the early Christians, this did not mean simply that Jesus came back from the dead and told us that there is an afterlife. This is not one of those near-death experiences of which we hear nowadays, of people who died, saw a great white light and came back. It is not just, as we might say today, proof positive that there is life after death. What Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians is not only that Jesus rose from the dead, what he's saying is also and above all that in rising from the dead, Jesus defeated death and began the new era of life and resurrection. Jesus is the first fruits of those who have died, and thanks to him and to his resurrection, we now can say, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?"